Andy Anderson from the Tupelo camp. Tonight we have Dr. Stuart Towns. I met this fellow down in Vicksburg at the national meeting. He was down there, and he has written, this is his fourth book about the enduring legacy about the South. And he did his undergraduate work at the University of Arkansas. Then he got his master's and PhD from the University of Florida. He's retired military, retired as a colonel in the Active Army Reserve, very active in the SCV, and he drove 2.5 hours to get here tonight, so let's give Dr. Stuart Towns a round of applause.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here with you all in Ripley. I tell you what, I believe I've talked to about 4 or 5 SCV camps in the last year and a half after my book came out, and I think this is I know it's the biggest crowd, and I think it's probably the most active and most excited bunch of folks I've seen in one of these meetings. So I'm really glad to be here, very proud to be here, and also to be in Ripley where there's so much Confederate history. This is incredible. We saw on the YouTube driving down here the YouTube shot of the Confederate Memorial Day last spring, held out in front of the courthouse. Wonderful program, fantastic program. Arkansas has one similar to that at the State Capitol building in Little Rock. We've been to it the last 2 or 3 years after I retired, moved back to Forest City, Arkansas. And by the way, that's Forest City, Arkansas with a double R, and you can imagine why. General Nathan Bedford had a camp there as he was building the railroad through out of Memphis and through Crowley's Ridge. So I'm from Forest City, Arkansas. I like to let people know about that.
People hear you back here.
Okay, yeah, y'all speak up if you can't hear me back there. I usually don't even use one of these things, but I want to be sure I get it out here to you tonight. To try to sum up in just a sentence or two about what my book is all about, the enduring legacy, rhetoric and ritual of the lost cause. You can tell by the cover, it has something to do with the Confederacy. My editor down at the University of Alabama Press called me up or sent me an email one day before it came out and said, I'm getting ready to send you a picture that I found that I took yesterday, Sunday afternoon. I was driving around Tuscaloosa down here and I saw this truck and this flag and said, I just think you might be interested in putting it on the cover of the book when it comes out. And he sent it to me, and I emailed him right back and said, do it. It's exactly what I want to say. So that worked out real well. But what I'm trying to do in this book is to talk about why the Southern tradition that all of us in this room adhere to and believe in and love and cherish is still alive 150 years after the Civil War. Robert E. Lee rode away from Appomattox, and it was all over, the North thought. But today, we still honor, we still cherish, we still commemorate those of our relatives and anybody else in the South, kin or no kin, who fought for what they believed in. And we can say that and understand that, but how did that tradition get created? Men walked back home from the war, hobbled back home, crutches, legs shot off, arms shot off, got back to their farms and they were destroyed. The businesses were ruined, bridges were out, roads were torn up, and they had nothing. Their economy was gone, many of their families were gone, many of their friends were gone. The cream of the crop of the South had been killed in the war. I've seen figures, and probably all of you have too, of at least 600,000 men died in the Civil War on both sides. And I've seen some figures here lately, they're saying maybe 700,000. That's the cream of the crop in the South. And so we need to take a look at how did that tradition that we celebrate and commemorate today get created. But first of all, let me just mention a couple of 3 things that are going on kind of to illustrate what that tradition is doing today. Some of these I think are very interesting, and they've things are happening right now over the last couple of years across the South, not just in Mississippi, but across the South. In Lexington, Virginia, the home of Washington Lee University, where Robert E. Lee, of course, was the president for several years after the war, there's a city ordinance was passed about 2 years ago that said that the only flags that could fly from the light poles in downtown Lexington were the United States flag, the Virginia flag, or the city of Lexington flag. Well, the SCV put in a proposal that they be allowed on Robert E. Lee's birthday, who's had been a staunch citizen of Lexington, that they would be able to fly the Confederate flag. And they were turned down after much debate over the issue. Well, on Robert E. Lee's birthday in 2011, the city of Lexington drove into work. Their students started going to school that morning. People came in downtown, and lo and behold, beneath every light pole in downtown Lexington, there was a SCV or a UDC member standing there, and guess what they were holding? A Confederate flag. And so that's just one little issue, one example of what I'm talking about. It's still alive today. In 2011, the Texas Department of Motor Vehicles voted unanimously to reject a proposal for specialty license plates that would have the Confederate flag on it. Unanimously. After hours of what I understand was very contentious debate and testimony. In Little Rock, on the other hand, over in Arkansas, my home state, on the day before Easter, the state officially pays homage in honor and commemorates the Confederate Memorial Day, just like you did here last spring, and I've seen the YouTube on that. But this is an officially sanctioned, state-sanctioned event, and so we are still celebrating and commemorating the Civil War. That Southern tradition that grew out of all of this activity and is still alive today, I think really occurred because of three events. And that's what these three events are what my book is about. One of them was Confederate Memorial Day, that you all still celebrate here. We still celebrate it in Little Rock. We celebrate it around the state of Arkansas. Fayetteville has a major event in the spring, the late spring, early June, in the Confederate Cemetery in Fayetteville up in the Ozark Mountains. That's one of them. Another one were the Confederate Veterans reunions. And the third one were the Confederate monument dedications. Just like you have a Confederate monument right here in Ripley, there are hundreds of Confederate monuments around the South, all stretching all the way from Virginia and Maryland all the way down to Texas and out into New Mexico, and I understand there's one up in Oregon, believe it or not. Those Confederate monument dedications, those Confederate Veterans reunions, and Confederate Memorial Day all have one thing in common. They all sing praises and contribute to the tradition of the South that we honor as members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, or the United Daughters of the Confederacy, or the Children of the Confederacy, or the Military Order, the Stars and Bars, or any of the other organizations that try to sustain that heritage. And they all had speeches. I'm an historian of Southern rhetoric. I got him when I was at the University of Arkansas. I took a course with a fantastic professor up there, and he was a Southern historian as well, and he got me just totally immersed in this idea of how the spoken word had such an impact on the South and on the nation. You know, we can think about Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. We can think about many of the speeches that have been made throughout our history, all the way from that era right up to the present time, that have had an impact on our history. One of my favorites was Ronald Reagan standing at the Berlin Wall and looking at the president of Russia, the USSR, of communism, and pointing to that wall and say, "Tear this wall down." And what did it take? 2 years? It was gone. You know, the spoken word has had a major impact on American history, in Southern history, and that's what my book deals with. And I think those speeches repeated over and over again, those same ideas, those same refrains, that same commemoration, that same honor being given to the Confederate veterans and their wives, by the way, which I'll mention in a minute, is how that tradition that we celebrate, that those of you in this room come here on the first Thursday of every month to celebrate, to commemorate, to honor. I'm a son of the Confederate Veterans Camp down in Andalusia, Alabama, so I don't get to go to the meetings down there very much. But at the same time, we all believe in this. And I think that tradition grew out of these speeches and these rituals at the Confederate monuments that were dedicated, the Confederate Veterans Reunions, and Confederate Memorial Day. Mark Twain, one of my favorite writers, described the emotional impact of the Civil War on the white Southern mind when he wrote in his book, Life on the Mississippi. In the South, the war is what AD is elsewhere. They date from it. All day long, you hear things placed as having happened since the war, or during the war, or before the war, or right after the war. It shows how intimately every individual was visited in his own person by that tremendous episode. So, given that background, let me talk about these three events just very briefly. Talk about how it really got this tradition started that we still celebrate and commemorate today. The first one I want to talk about are the Confederate Memorial Days. I understand you all are doing a great project here in your camp with the Beck Cemetery, restoring it, bringing it back to some semblance of normality and sense of beauty there. Well, the Confederate veterans' wives who were back home started that process in April of 1865 across the South, in every state. Women were seen down at the graveyards and cemeteries, cleaning things up, planting some flowers, trimming the bushes over the Confederate graves that had been Confederate soldiers who had already been buried there by that time. And that caught on very, very quickly. And I'll give you one example here from the state of Mississippi. In fact, there's a lot of debate, I won't say some, there's a lot of debate over where the first Memorial Day was. And Mississippi claims that spot among about 4 or 5 other states that I'll mention here in a second. But in Jackson, Mississippi, Sue Landon Vaughn, called the Lady with the Roses, was what she was named in the newspaper accounts that I've read, was known for decorating the graves of Confederate and Union soldiers in Jackson's Greenwood Cemetery. Some of you have probably been there. She issued a plea in the local newspaper for women to meet her at the cemetery on April 26, 1865, for a ceremony. And the Confederate State Monument in Jackson declares her the founder of Decoration Day. Well, there are several others. Virginia, a couple of places in Virginia, Winchester, Virginia, and a couple of other places. And Columbus, Georgia is another one. And I've written quite a bit about the Columbus, Georgia event in my book because I found so much material on it, just tremendously well documented. This grassroots movement began to really take hold when Mrs. Mary Williams of Columbus, Georgia, took a leadership role in promoting April the 26th, just like Ms. Vaughn had done in Jackson, as a region-wide day of observance in memory of those who had died in the war. She wrote a letter to every newspaper, I think, in Mississippi or in the South that was publishing at the time, and said, we've got to do this for our soldiers, for our dead. And it just caught on and spread like wildfire all over the South. Just to give you an idea about how that caught on, let me read to you a little bit about a speech that was made at that time by Alfred Moore Waddell. Alfred Moore Waddell was a congressman from North Carolina. He had been a lieutenant colonel in the Confederate forces. Later was mayor of Wilmington, North Carolina. A very well-known figure and a very well-known speaker. And here's a speech that he made, a part of a speech that he made on Memorial Day in New Bern, North Carolina. And he sums up, I think, very, very well exactly what Memorial Day is all about. Ladies of the Memorial Association, it is customary on these occasions for those who perform the duty assigned to me today to paint as best they may that picture of the past on which Southern eyes will always gaze with admiration, and before which Southern hearts will always throb with mingled pride and sorrow. They try to portray in vivid colors the heroism, the splendid courage, the patient toil and suffering, the unselfish patriotism, and the sublime devotion of our countrymen who died in an unequal struggle for the preservation of what they believe to be the sacred inheritance of constitutional liberty bequeathed to them by their fathers. And so that's, I think, a good summation of what Memorial Day is all about. They're trying to commemorate, to honor those Confederate soldiers who had died fighting for what they believed was correct. The second lost cause ritual that I write about is the dedication ceremony held at every Confederate monument across the South. You always had a speaker of the day. You always had some poetry read. You always had some music sung. You always had an orator. And these orators helped to build this tradition of speaking over and over again about what does this monument mean to us in this community and to us in the South. And it always boils down to honor, commemoration of our dead and the contribution that they made. And many, many times they also talked about the women who did so much to raise the money for those monuments. If you stop to think, put yourself back in 1875, 1885, 1895, around the turn of the century, when the economy was still in a slump. The economy was still had been destroyed, and it had not been rebuilt. And so you can imagine trying to scrape together pennies and nickels and dimes and so on to try to rebuild or to build, erect these monuments that we see all across the South. The great folk hero of the Confederacy, of course, was Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee had been defeated, but he was still held up as the leader and the hero, the heroic figure of the South. Many monuments across the South were dedicated to Lee. There's one in Marianna, Arkansas, Robert E. Lee Monument in Marianna, Arkansas, which is in Lee County in Arkansas. And so Lee was the great folk hero. At Washington Lee University, became Washington Lee after he died, they dedicated a chapel for him, for his body, and they dedicated a mausoleum over his body. And at the unveiling of his tomb in June of 1883, John Warwick Daniel delivered the oration of the day. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Lexington, Virginia or not. It's up in the Smoky Mountains, just off of the Blue Ridge Parkway, Shenandoah Valley, up in that area. Pretty tough to get to in 1883. I can imagine driving a wagon through those mountains to get into Lexington to hear that speech by John W. Daniel. Or I can imagine walking through those mountains to get into Lexington to hear that speech. 8,000 to 10,000 people were in the audience that day. 8,000 to 10,000 people. It just blows my mind. I don't think there's that many people who live in Lexington today. And they had 8,000 to 10,000 people come there in 1883. He held the audience by the spell of his eloquence, according to the newspaper. He moved it now to applause and now to tears. He summed up much of the lost cause in 2 sentences. And this carries over, it's just not honoring Lee, but it carries over to the entire Confederacy. Robert Edward Lee made fiercer and bloodier fight against greater odds and at greater sacrifice and lost against the greatest nation of modern history, armed with steam and electricity and all the appliances of modern science, a nation which mustered its host at the very threshold of its door. But his life teaches the grandest lesson, how manhood can rise transcendent over adversity. Now, there's one other little part of that speech. It was a long speech. They spoke, I've promised I won't speak over 2 hours tonight, but those guys back in that era, they were just getting warmed up at 2 hours. And so there's a long speech. But here's a little passage from that speech, which I think is very, very important. This was in 1883. The war ended in 1865. In that period of time, the country was still divided pretty horribly. And reconciliation was not on anybody's mind. Daniel, in this speech, begins to trigger, he's one of the very first speakers who begins to make any kind of public statement at all in the South about reconciliation. And he began this process, I think, in this speech by using Robert E. Lee as his example. I think it was a brilliant rhetorical move on his part. And here's what he says about Lee's forgiving spirit. Lee had nothing in common with the little minds that know not how to forgive. His was the land that had been invaded. His the people who were cut down. We were just talking a while ago about all the land that was destroyed, homes destroyed, and people destroyed across the South. His was the cause that perished. He was the general discrowned of his mighty place, and he the citizen disfranchised. Yet Lee forgave and counseled all to forgive and forget. And so with that speech and then constant repetition of that idea in the next 20 or 30 years, the South and the North began to pull back together. And by the time the Spanish-American War was fought in 1898, many Southerners signed up with the United States Forces, United States Army, United States Navy, and fought in that war for the American flag. So I think that process was started by these same traditions that I'm talking about with these three different events. The third focal point for the Lost Cause rhetoric were the annual veterans reunions and organizations that met frequently to, just like you guys are doing here tonight, like the UDC does and the Military Order of the Stars and Bars and so on. Get together, I think I always picture some caveman back 10,000 years ago throwing a rock at one of his next cave neighbors down the trail that he got mad at, and all of a sudden he gets two of his other caveman buddies there and they throw rocks at him and the guy moves out and moves on down the countryside. And then 2 months later those 3 or 4 cavemen get together and build a fire and tell lies about what they did. And I think veterans have done that since time immemorial. I spent 30 years in the active Army Reserve, a couple of years on active duty, and I've been around those campfires and I know what happens. But at any rate, these reunions gained national attention in the last 3 decades of the 19th century. By the time the 20th century rolled around, the veterans were dying very rapidly, moving on, and so they began to die out. The reunions began to die out, but one of the last veterans reunions, Confederate veterans reunions, was held in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1949. There was another one in Little Rock in 1928. There was another big one in Little Rock in 1911. And so they continued for a long period of time. At the July 1875 reunion of a unit called Orr's Rifles in Walhalla, South Carolina, General Samuel McGowan, who had been a general in that unit, described what he believed was the function of the typical reunion. And here again, he nails it. He hits it right on target. Let us in peace and in quiet, without malice or hatred to any, hold sweet conversations one with another. Talk over the past with all its hopes and fears, joys and sorrows. Recount the stories of the bivouac and the campfire. And as we pass, drop a silent tear over the sweet memory of some comrade whom we buried on the battlefield, and recall the long marches and bloody battles in which we suffered and struggled, hungered and toiled, and fought and bled together. The reunion was a success. The local newspaper had this to say about it. The reunion of the survivors of Orr's Rifles was everything that the most ardent Confederate and patriotic citizen could wish. No bitterness, no discontent, only a loving pride in the soldiers who fell, a fond recollection of the days that are past, and a fixed determination to be as true to their new allegiance as these brave riflemen were to the cause of the South. The cause may have been lost, but the veterans would do their share in sustaining the memory. John Brown Gordon, who was a general, one of Lee's top generals, in fact, he was the man who once Lee began to realize that surrender was right around the corner. The Confederacy had gone about as far as they could go. He asked Gordon to be one of the 3 Confederate generals who went to negotiate with Grant at Appomattox. And so Gordon was one of the top generals. He attended the University of Georgia. He was a top orator in his class, and he became a captain, entered the Confederate Army as a captain in the South Alabama Regiment, and he rose to the rank of Major General. He was wounded 5 times at Antietam, but returned to action 7 months later. In an 1887 speech at Augusta, Georgia, Gordon spoke all over the country about the Civil War, from California to New York. But here's a speech, an excerpt from a speech he made in Augusta, Georgia in 1887 at the reunion of the Augusta Survivors Association, they called it. And I like to compare this kind of picture in my mind here as I read this little section. Margaret Mitchell, the lady who wrote Gone with the Wind. I can picture her sitting in her study up in Atlanta, writing Gone with the Wind. And all of a sudden she gets stuck. You know, we writers get stuck. Writer's block is one of those things we've got to live with. Sometimes you just can't think of another word to say. And she hit that point, and she did it periodically, just like we all do. And she looked up on the wall, and she's got this quotation from this speech framed on her wall. Now, I know she really didn't, but I like to tell the story. At any rate, and here it is. And she reads that passage, and she's, oh, yeah, okay. So she starts, writer's block is gone, and she starts writing again. Listen to this, and tell me if it doesn't come from Gone with the Wind. It was a civilization, talking about the South. It was a civilization where personal courage, personal independence, personal dignity, personal honor, and the manliest virtues were nurtured, where feminine refinement, feminine purity, feminine culture, delicacy, and gentleness expressed themselves in models of rarest loveliness and perfection, and where, in the language of a great Georgian, hospitality was as free and boundless as the vitalizing air around us. Sounds like Margaret Mitchell to me. But at any rate, telling the story of the Old South. And that's what these speakers did over and over and over again, praising the Southern soldier over and over and over again, praising the women who had gone out to raise the money to build these monuments, to have Confederate Memorial Day, to put the programs together. And you also have to remember that was an era when women were not out in public. They were housewives. But these women went out and raised money in the public. They went out and had programs in the public. They went out and organized the programs. They went to the state legislators and had meetings with the state legislatures around the South to fund monuments and to fund Confederate Memorial Day and to support Confederate Memorial Day. There's a great story of, I believe it was in Georgia, the state legislature was about to vote on I think they were going to put $1,000 into building a monument on the state capitol grounds, and the gallery of the state legislature was filled with Georgia women there to let the legislators know, we want that monument. They got it. And so this constant repetition of the praise of the women, praise of the soldiers, praise of the South, praise of the generals and the leadership and so on, created the tradition that every one of us in this room and many, 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 many other Southerners still adhere to, believe in, and I still honor in 2014. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. Y'all ask me any questions. I'll be glad to talk with you about them, answer questions, whatever. Like you said, I've got a couple of books over here. If anybody's interested in picking one of those up, I'll sign them and so on. But does anybody have any questions?
How much are your books?
Okay, the the hardback copy, Enduring Legacy, that's the one I basically spoke about tonight. It's $30. The Arkansas Civil War Heritage just came out about a month ago, and it's $20. And it's got a lot of the same kind of information. I wrote it just about Arkansas as opposed to across the whole South, like Enduring Legacy. Any questions, comments, reactions to the presentation?
Thank you.
Thank you.